When you're sitting in a movie theater, which armrest is yours? I need to label them so we know. Hey everybody, I'm Robert. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video and go over some viewers' comments left on this channel here in the last week or so. I guess as of, by the time you guys see this, will be the last couple of weeks. These are all comments that were left on a video that I did recently on greatest underrated guitar players ever. So we're going to read some comments. I'm going to enjoy my mango mojito that I made for myself here. Here we go. All right, so recently I did a video on the greatest underrated guitar players ever, and I thought it would be fun to go over some of the comments left on that video and see who you guys mentioned that are also great underrated guitar players. And yeah, so that's what we're going to do. Here we go. I totally agree with C.C. DeVille. I've always wanted to see Poison live. A pandemic hit, so that didn't happen. Agree with Prince. He mastered all instruments. Agree about McMars. He's not like other members of the crew. Yada, yada, yada. Et cetera, et cetera. Steve Stevens is extremely gifted as well. That's my 2 cents. I agree with you. Steve Stevens is an excellent guitar player. Maybe one of the best ever. The problem that, the reason why I wouldn't have added him to my list is because Steve Stevens is pretty well known. And back in the 80s, not especially back in the 80s, not only was his name pretty much synonymous with Billy Idol's, but he garnered a lot of attention in the guitar community back then. Steve Stevens is also one of the guys that wrote the very famous guitar theme to the movie Top Gun. That was a Steve Stevens track, believe it or not. Carlos Casavana, Quiet Riot. I'm assuming you're referring to Carlos Cavazo, and of Quiet Riot, and yes, I agree with you. Another excellent guitarist. Man, the problem with the 80s, man, there were so many guitar players back then that, it was real easy to get lost in the shuffle. Back in those days, every great guitar player on the planet was, in a band with a record deal. Now Quiet Riot be one of the earlier members, but you also got to remember that band's original guitar player was Randy Rhoads. So, he had some pretty big shoes to fill too. I don't envy him for that. Great list. Some of my picks are Vinnie Vincent, Vivian Campbell, Andy Clark, Trey Azagthoth, and Chuck Schuldiner. Great, good picks there as well. Vinnie Vincent, of course, I think probably best known for playing, and he had a stint in Kiss. Vivian Campbell, of course, played in a number of bands. I think most famously Dio, and now currently Def Leppard. There's been talk here in the last couple of years that he might get back together. The original, the remaining original Dio members might do a reunion. So I don't know. Fingers crossed if they do. I think that'd be pretty cool. Andy Clark of St. Vincent, of St. Vincent fame. I think that's who you're referring to. She's getting a lot of attention right now. There's no way I could consider her underrated. She's, like you said, she's garnering a lot of attention. Trey Azagthoth of was it Corrosion Conformity? One of those. Morbid Angel. Morbid Angel and Chuck Schuldiner of Death. I'm gonna have to take your word for it on those two, just because I'm not much of a death metal guy. So that's just not my jam. I would say Gary Moore and Andy Latimer. Gary Moore is definitely a good pick. Coming out of that group of guys from the virtuosos from the 70s. Gary Moore his name does seem to get mentioned a lot in those conversations, though. A lot of people seem to have respect for Gary Moore. Greg Tribbett from Mudvayne. Tribbett. I'm not familiar with him. Harry Cody, Shotgun Messiah, Mark Diglio, XYZ. Again, there's a couple more guys that I'm not terribly familiar with. So again, I will take your word for it. Paul Stanley is terrible. Yeah, okay. Tell me, how many stadiums have you sold out in your career? Oh, 0, you said? Oh, wow. Imagine that. Excellent episode, Robert. Truly enjoyed this one. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. etc., etc., etc. As for underrated guitarists, Alex Lifeson is highly underrated. Yes, he's gained a lot of prominence in 40 years playing in a band, but very seldom is he mentioned in the same conversations as, say, Edward Van Halen or John McLaughlin or Alan Holdsworth. Lifeson's every bit as talented. Glad to hear you mention Vernon Reid. He's an insane player with and away from Living Colour. Sorry, super long post, but great episode. Keep up the great work. A lot of people mentioned Alex Lifeson, and here's the thing: I can't consider Alex Lifeson an underrated guitar player, because you're talking about a guy with a Gibson endorsement for the second time, and in between the two, he had a PRS endorsement. You're talking about a guy who's a member of a 3-piece band that honestly sounds like a 6-piece band who were just inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last year. And last but not least, he's also one of the main guys that put Hughes and Kettner on the map. He's been playing those tri-amps forever, every generation of them. And I think they might even have a signature model out for him now. He's been a big Hughes and Kettner endorser for a long, long time. I mean, honestly, it's hard to talk about Hughes and Kettner without talking about Alex Lifeson. So, for those reasons. By the way, he's also a pretty okay guitar player, and he's written some pretty iconic stuff. But with all that in mind, it's real hard for me to consider Alex Lifeson as underrated because he's got a lot of accolades to his name. Greg Howe would be on my list of greatest underrated guitar players. Glad I had a chance to meet with him in person. I really like Greg Howe, man. That dude, from a skill perspective, that guy's up here. He's up there with Steve Vai and Satriani and Yngwie. He's that good. And he's got a couple of DV Mark signature amps. Actually, it sound really good, but he's one of those people. I think a lot of guitar players know who he is, but your average Joe doesn't. He's the one guy that I know of that actually had a signature deal with Laguna Guitars, who were Laguna Guitars were a Guitar Center proprietary guitar brand once upon a time. They made a model for him called the LE924. I've been looking for one forever because it's a killer guitar. They sold brand new. They were only like $1,000 or so when they were being made. So it's not an overly really really high end guitar or anything, but it's one of those guitars that even though it's an import, it's a lot of guitar for the money. So if anybody out there sees a Laguna LE924 out there anywhere, let me know because I'm probably interested. Steve Winwood is an underrated guitar player. He brought the best out of Clapton. Ooh, there's a strong argument for that. There's a real strong argument for that. It's because Steve Winwood and Eric Clapton they did a lot of stuff together throughout like the 60s and 70s and and even into the 80s. There for a while, like Blind Faith and Clapton wasn't, but Steve Winwood I think was in the Spencer Davis group. He's done a lot. I first. When I think of Steve Winwood, I always think of his solo career back in the 80s. That's I think because he was getting a lot of airplay. His song was getting a lot of airplay back then. But once all that stuff died down, you haven't really heard his name too much anymore. He's done a couple of the Clapton Blues festivals and things of that nature. But you're underrated nowadays, very possibly. Back in the day, though, like in the heyday when he was really, really active, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I don't know, man. He was pretty well recognized. Good list. Ty Tabor is my favorite underrated guitar player. It's almost inevitable somebody's going to mention Ty Tabor when one of these lists comes up. A lot of people really, really like Ty Tabor. Ty Tabor's a guitar player for the band King's X, by the way, if you don't know who he is. Walter Becker, Steely Dan. I don't know, man. I think there's a stronger argument for Elliott Randall. The reason, and I attribute that to one song. That song, of course, being "Reelin' in the Years." And that is the solo and that song, all the guitar work, but the solo in particular in that song is very, very famous, very well known. You've probably got it playing in your head right now just because I mentioned it. So, to my knowledge, that was Elliott Randall, and When it comes to conversations about guitar, great guitar players, underrated guitar players, Elliot Randall's name you never hear mentioned. I find as much as people do know John Five, I feel that he was way overlooked. Never see him really in any top 10 lists. The vast amount he can play is unreal. He's a talented guy, man. I've seen him live a couple of times, and both times I've seen him live were he was with Rob Zombie, and he only made Rob Zombie's band a whole lot better. But even if you go back before his days with with Marilyn Manson and and his solo stuff, I do agree with you, because what a lot of people don't know is John Five did a lot of session work in Nashville, and he is very, very well versed in not just rock and metal genres. I mean, he can play blues, he can play country, he can play jazz, he can literally do just about anything. I don't know this for sure, but I have a theory that it was his experience as a session player in Nashville that he learned to acquire his love for Telecasters. Because if you don't know this about John Five, he is he loves Telecasters. Obviously, he's got signature models, but he's also got a collection of vintage Tellies, and he's trying to collect them all, but he's got the last I knew anyway, he had a few gaps, a few years that he was missing from the 50s and 60s, the butterscotch blackguard stuff, the really, really expensive ones. I think he found that love from playing in Nashville. It makes sense to me anyway, because another thing that's worth mentioning, I don't know too many other guitar players that love Telecasters like that dude does. I always thought Rob Cavastani from Death Angel was a bit underrated, and Eric Peterson from Testament. He's a riff monster. Prince is an awesome guitar player. I think a lot of sessions guitarists and other guitarists in country music, new and old, are insane guitar players. Again, I got to include John Five in that category, that very last category. My ads, Mark Kendall from Great White. That's a good one. That's a real good one. Mark Kendall's a great guitar player, great rock guitar player, and he does not. What I've always found unique about Mark Kendall is he has a tendency to back off on the gain control. I mean, he's a plug a Les Paul straight into a Marshall Plexi kind of guy, and like I said, doesn't use a lot of gain at all, but it's a killer sound, especially for that band. Frank Hannon of Tesla, also another good one. Frank Hannon is a really, really talented guitar player. Misha Calvin and Niley Brosh of Death Clock fame, of course. Not a real big fan of those last two, but Mark Kendall and Frank Hannon, absolutely. Robert Gray List's been getting into a lot of Judas Priest lately, and I'll tell you what, Tipton and Downing were great players and came up with some awesome riffs. Rock on, my brother. I don't disagree with you. I love Judas Priest. I'm a huge Priest fan. I love KK Downing and Glenn Tipton. Both of them. But underrated. I don't. You're talking about the metal gods here, man. I mean, I don't think they're underrated at all. I mean, those are the guys that were basically putting metal on the map back in the late 70s, early 80s. But I will agree with you on one front. Monster guitar players, both of them, still to this day. Robert, great list. One that is missed is guitar player Scott Gorham, who played with Thin Lizzy from the beginning to what now is another version of Thin Lizzy. His Blazing Souls are unbelievable. Didn't get any credit for his playing. But I know you can't have everybody on your list. Actually, that's a pretty good pick. That's a pretty good pick. I like Thin Lizzy, and I think Thin Lizzy in particular is just kind of an underrated band. And back in their era, they were like a really, really spacey psychedelic, type of band, which back then was perfectly normal. But because of that, their music didn't necessarily translate into future eras quite as easily, but and I think that's the reason why so many people have kind of, I hate to say forgotten about them, because everybody knows the boys back in town, but they unfortunately don't seem to be quite as celebrated today as other bands who were their peers back in that era. Nick Giraldo, and of course the great Veto Brata. These guys get no love. Veto Brata in particular, that's another good one. Veto Brata was a guitar player from the band White Lion, which they had a couple of hits back in the 80s, early 90s. Veto Brata is a monster guitar player. He was one of the best guys. I mean, like the guitar magazines were giving him a lot of attention back then. Then the day came when that genre kind of started to fall by the wayside, and a lot of those bands were struggling to stay. I hate to use this term, but stay relevant in lieu of the grunge era. This is a hard one. There's a lot of guitar players I like. I do really like Lee Malia from Bring Me the Horizon. Great, Lee Malia is a good guitar player, but I think he's actually really popular with the millennial generation guitar players right now. I think a lot of people in that that younger age bracket, guitar players in particular, seem to really like Lee Malia. Prince was a genius as well as being a fantastic guitarist. I thought you would have included Frank Zappa. Shut up and play your guitar. Converted me into a fan. We had a discussion about this in the comments section, and I can't consider Frank Zappa an underrated guitar player, an underrated anything. Frank Zappa is one of those artists that had a lot of fans outside of musicians. I mean, there's people that just love Frank Zappa that are not musicians at all. I've got a buddy of mine who's a generation older than me, not a musician at all, and drove around listening to Frank Zappa in his truck all over the place when, at the time that we met, and still is today. I mean, the dude just loves Frank Zappa. There's a lot of other people out there that feel the same way about Frank Zappa. I mean, he's really, really popular. I don't think he was as overlooked as a guitar player or even as a musician as, say, Prince. Who was, I think, his musicianship was very overlooked by the general public, and most of his fan base. I don't know that Frank Zappa was perceived by as many people the same way. Robert, I have a few underrated guitarists that are not mentioned enough. Michael Shanker, great guitar player, but I know a lot of people that like Michael Shanker. Terry Kath has been mentioned a number of times. Got to give credit there. Kurt Vanderhoof, Middle Church, Jake E. Lee. If you're comparing Jake E. Lee to other Aussie guitar players, especially the two main ones that he was sandwiched in between, Randy Rhoads and Zakk Wylde. A lot of I guess I agree with you now that I think about it. I mean, a lot of people don't know that Jake E. Lee was just as good as either of those guys. Jake E. Lee is a great guitar player. Peter Frampton. I don't know, man. Peter Frampton, again, that's another guy who was a really, really big name in the guitar community back in the 70s, and garnered a lot of attention. But I mean, he's also probably one of, if not the main reason why the 3-pickup Les Paul Custom, aka the Black Beauty, is still popular today. Peter Frampton was synonymous with that guitar. Brad Woodford. That's a good one. That's a really good one. I saw Brad Woodford live on the very first Experience Hendrix tour, I think in 2010, I think it was. And I didn't know I didn't know it was him for the longest time. It was in here in Indianapolis we have a theater called the Murat, and there was there's the big downstairs theater where this show was taking place, and there's a smaller one upstairs. This one's on the big theater downstairs. It's 2 levels. I was probably 20 rows up from the stage or so, which is about right in the middle ish. The Experience Hendrix tour was, it was just musicians that were just kind of rotating in and out all night long. A bunch of people, big names. Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Vernon Reid, Steve Vai, Johnny Lang. There was a bunch of people on this tour. Billy Cox, bunch of people that were on that tour. And there was one segment of the show where there was this dude who was just sitting there on the back of the, kind of towards the back of the stage, off to the side, staying out of everybody's way, playing a Strat, wearing, a pair of ripped up jeans, a tie-dye t-shirt, I think flip-flops, Kind of had this long hair and a beard. And, I kept looking. I was like, it looks kind of familiar, but I can't figure out who he is. Finally, they mentioned it was Brad Woodford. And my jaw hit the floor because this dude was playing a Strat. And, I didn't recognize him, because with Aerosmith, I usually see him playing a Les Paul. He's a lot more clean cut. He's very clean cut when playing with Aerosmith. He wasn't, with Aerosmith, he's not in hippie mode. So, that's why I didn't recognize him. But, man, that dude could play. He was wailing on that Strat for, I don't know, probably 30 or 40 minutes. I really, really enjoyed him. I had no idea that guy was that good. I think Fast Eddie, Clark, Richard Thompson, James Hetfield, Tony Iommi, Dave Murray. The first Fast Eddie, Clark, Richard Thompson, off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with those guys, so I'll give you those. But Tony Iommi, Black Sabbath, Dave Murray of Iron Maiden, and especially James Hetfield, the main, the rhythm guitar player and primary songwriter for Metallica, the most popular heavy metal band in the history of this planet. Underrated. I don't know about that, man. I don't agree with any of those. Let's see. For me, Warren D. Martini is one of the most underrated guys in the industry. I never liked hair metal all that much, but I really got to give credit to that man. His talent for amazing riffs is inhuman. I agree with you on his talent level. Warren D. Martini is an insanely talented guitar player. Underrated? No way. Back in the mid-'80s, man, he and George Lynch were dominating all of the attention from, the guitar magazines in particular. And that's, back then, that's how a lot of the stuff was gauged. How much, how interested are the guitar magazines in you as a guitar player? Warren D. Martini was getting a lot of attention. He was on a lot of covers, and Rat was, of the hair metal bands, and I hate to call them hair metal bands, but, nowadays I guess that's what they were, in that era. Rat were one of the more popular bands out there, and a lot of that had to do with the talent of Warren D. Martini, because, as you said, he was, not only a great riff, master, but, not only that, but he's also a hell of a lead guitar player. So, yeah. Great list, Robert. I was surprised you forgot Chris Holmes of Wasp. He is also an underrated guitar player, but still out there kicking it. Chris Holmes again, another guy from that era, and again, Wasp were, they were a band that, a lot of people, fans of that genre in that era are familiar with, that's, I wanted, number one, I wanted to keep my list at 10, so, I had to cut it off somewhere, Chris Holmes is one of those guys that, unfortunately I had to make a decision, but yeah, absolutely, I agree. Inside every guitar store in America is a 16-year-old who can play better than me. The question is, will they stick with it? A quote from Kim Thale. A pretty accurate quote, actually. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Great list. Hit most of my picks. We'll add Ken Hensley, Teenie Hodges, Michael Bruce, Terry Kath. I'm a man still floors me, 50 years on. Dave Evans is like Prince. And the Do You Get Everything He's Doing realm. Believe it or not, Michael Bolton is one damn fine rock guitarist. Honestly, I forgot about Michael Bolton. I knew that. I didn't forget that he started his career in a metal band. He was in a metal band called Blackjack, by the way. They were a killer band. But again, they were in a really, really crowded market, and they were having a tough time breaking through. Which is why Michael Bolton decided to switch his. Decided to start switching his singing style to classical and love ballads and all the stuff that he's really known for. But prior to all that, he was a metal guy, and I also have to assume that not only was he a metal guy, I've got to assume there's still a part of him today that still really appreciates it. Oz Fox and Michael Sweet from Stripe are very underrated guitarists. Also Kristen Pelletieri, another underrated guitarist. That name rings a bell, and I can't recall from where. I want to say Queensryche, but I don't think that's right. Noona Bettencourt from Extreme, very underrated guitarist. That I disagree with. Nuno's, he's another one of those guys that's up there, in the Steve Vai, Joe Satriani era, realm as far as talent level. That dude's badass. He was also, let's not forget, he was in. He's in Extreme, is the guitar player for Extreme, a band with a big, big number one hit back in that era. And More Than Words. And he wrote it. Tony McAlpine. Yeah. I'm kind of back and forth on that one because, you know, Tony McAlpine's another guy that's, you know, that's an A-level top-notch musician. You know, probably doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. I was not familiar with him until he started playing in Steve Vai's band about 20 years ago now. And he's been around a lot longer than that. John Sykes and the late Chris Oliva, both great but underrated. There's two names that were mentioned by more than one person. John Sykes, I can't consider him an underrated guitar player. I just cannot. You know, John Sykes was, you know, he's another one of those guys back in the 80s. He was a big deal. I mean, I had, pictures of John Sykes ripped out of magazines hanging on my wall, on my bedroom wall when I was a kid. John Sykes was badass. Everybody knew, you know, even if you didn't know Whitesnake, you were at least familiar with the name John Sykes. Chris Oliva, on the other hand, I admit the first time I heard that, the first time somebody mentioned that name, I wasn't familiar, and I kind of turned my nose up at it because not this comment, but another one, somebody else that mentioned it, I didn't like the way that he worded it because it sounded like he was criticizing me for not knowing who he was. So I did go to the trouble to look him up, and he was a guitar player for Savatage. Savatage was they were a good band back in the 80s, a really good band, but they were kind of an underground band as well. Not everybody was familiar with Savatage, and then Chris Oliva apparently also went on to be one of the people that formed TSO, Trans-Siberian Orchestra. So Tony Rambeau from Godsmack / another Animal / Apocalypse Blues Revival guy has chops for days, way more than just down to chugging. Ooh, strong argument to be made there. Godsmack are probably one of the most popular, well-known hard rock metal bands on the planet today. But I think outside of Sully Erna, I'm not, most people I don't think could name a single member of that band. And and you're right, Tony Rambeau is a great guitar player. You naming Mick Mars as number one underrated guitarist was enough to finally make me unsubscribe from this horrible channel. You know what? To quote Wolfgang Van Halen, eat my ass, bro. By the way, this ain't an airport. You don't need to announce your departure, douchebag. So there is your 2 cents about some underrated guitar players that were out there. A lot of them were mentioned. A lot of them, there were some great mentions, and honestly, there was not nearly as many that I would have thought of myself. So something to be said for that. Thank you for taking the time to check out this video. Subscribe down below if you have not already. Please leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts, and maybe your comment will appear in a future viewer comments video. Thank you so much for watching. Adios.